Mr. Whitmore, what about the 2008 charity fraud? The question lands like a crack through glass, sharp enough to silence a room filled with tailored suits and polished smiles. And in that instant, every camera lifts, every pen pauses, every breath seems to hang suspended in the bright white light of the conference hall. Richard Whitmore stands at the podium, fingers resting against the edge of clear acrylic, posture perfect, expression controlled, but something flickers in his eyes, just for a second, as the word fraud echoes louder than it should, louder than the clicking shutters, louder than the murmurs beginning to ripple across the room. Behind him, just off to the side where no one is supposed to look, Ava Johnson stands with a folded cloth in her hand, her uniform crisp but simple, her presence nearly invisible against the marble and glass. Yet her heart begins to pound because that question is not just noise to her, it is memory. It is something she has seen before, something she has carried quietly while moving through hallways no one notices. And now it is right here, spoken out loud in front of the entire world. Richard clears his throat, his voice measured as he begins to respond. Something polished, something practiced, but the words feel thinner than usual, like they are stretching over something unstable beneath. And Ava sees it, the small hesitation, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers press just a little too firmly against the podium. And she knows. He doesn't remember the truth the way she does. Or maybe he never knew it fully at all. The reporters lean forward, sensing weakness, sensing a crack in the image, and the lights seem harsher now, reflecting off the floor in long cold streaks, while Ava takes one small step forward without realizing it, her shoes barely making a sound against the polished surface, her breath steady even as everything inside her tells her to stay silent, to stay invisible, to stay in the place the world has assigned her. But the memory pushes through anyway. The file, the late night, the signatures that didn't match, the moment no one listened, and suddenly the silence feels heavier than speaking, and before she can stop herself, her voice rises just enough to be heard, soft but clear, cutting through the tension like a thread pulled tight. Sir, it wasn't fraud. And for a split second the entire room shifts, heads turning not toward the stage but toward her, confusion replacing certainty, curiosity replacing control, and Richard's eyes snap toward the sound, sharp, unfamiliar, as if he's hearing something he wasn't prepared for, something he cannot immediately place. The space between them stretches, filled with expectation, disbelief, and something else, something that feels like the edge of truth about to surface, whether anyone is ready for it or not. The words hang in the air longer than they should, soft but impossible to ignore, and Ava feels every pair of eyes in the room shift toward her, measuring, questioning, dismissing before she even has the chance to explain. Richard Whitmore turns fully now, his posture still composed, but his gaze sharp, searching her face as if trying to understand how someone like her could interrupt something like this. And for a moment neither of them speaks, the silence stretching tight like a wire about to snap. A reporter in the front row leans forward, sensing something unexpected, while another raises a phone just a little higher, capturing the shift, capturing the disruption, because this is no longer just a routine press conference. This is something unfolding. Ava keeps her shoulders steady even as her grip tightens slightly around the cloth in her hand, the fabric rough against her palm grounding her, reminding her of where she stands, reminding her of what she risks by saying anything more. And yet the memory refuses to fade. It presses forward, demanding to be heard. Richard's voice comes next, controlled but edged with something colder. You are out of line, he says, not raising his volume, not needing to, because authority does not need to shout when it expects to be obeyed. And a few people in the room nod subtly, already agreeing, already placing her back into the role they understand. But Ava does not step back. Instead, she takes one slow breath, her eyes meeting his, for the first time without hesitation. And there is no challenge in her expression, only certainty, the kind that does not come from confidence and status, but from knowing something that cannot be unseen. I read the report, she says quietly, her voice steady enough to cut through the low murmurs beginning to rise again. The numbers did not match the final filing. And that is enough to change the air, just enough that a few executives exchange quick glances, subtle but real. Because now this is no longer just an interruption, it is a statement. Richard's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly, his fingers shifting against the podium as if anchoring himself. And for a brief second something crosses his face, something close to recognition or maybe discomfort, but it is gone just as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by control, by distance, by the practiced certainty of someone who has built an empire on never showing doubt. Security, he says, not looking away from her, and the word moves faster than anything else in the room, because two men at the edge of the hall begin walking forward immediately, their steps measured, professional, as if this is routine, as if removing her is the natural order being restored. The cameras follow them now, lenses shifting away from Richard and toward Ava, because conflict is always more compelling than control, and for the first time, she feels the weight of visibility. Not the quiet invisibility she has lived in, but something sharper, something exposed. Still, she does not raise her voice, does not argue, does not plead. She simply holds her ground for one more second and says, "If you check the original case file from August, you will see it." And there is no accusation in her tone, no defiance, only a calm insistence that truth exists whether anyone chooses to acknowledge it or not. The security guards reach her now, stopping just close enough to signal the end of her presence. And as one of them gestures politely toward the exit, Ava finally steps back, not because she has been silenced, but because she has said what needed to be said, and as she turns, the reflection of the room stretches across the polished floor beneath her feet. Lights, cameras, power, all of it slightly distorted, as if even the space itself is beginning to shift around a truth that has just been spoken aloud. The doors close softly behind Ava, the sound almost swallowed by the hum of the building. Yet inside the conference hall the atmosphere does not recover the way it should. Something remains unsettled, something unspoken lingering beneath the polished surface. Richard Whitmore turns back toward the podium, adjusting his cuff with precise control, but the rhythm of the room has shifted. The reporters no longer fully listening to his prepared response, their attention fractured, their curiosity sharpened by what just happened, because a single unexpected voice has introduced doubt where certainty once stood. He resumes speaking, his tone steady, measured, the kind that has carried him through countless negotiations and public statements. But now each word feels like it is being weighed more carefully, examined more closely, and even he can sense it, the subtle difference in how the room responds. The way eyes linger just a little longer, the way pens hesitate before moving again. Somewhere in the second row, a journalist scrolls quickly through archived notes, searching for the mention of that case. August filings, discrepancies, anything that aligns with what was just said, and across the room two executives exchange a glance that says more than any spoken sentence, a silent question forming between them. Richard finishes his statement, stepping back from the podium with the same composed posture. But as the applause begins, it is thinner than before, less certain, like an echo that does not fully commit. And he notices, of course he notices, because he has built his life on reading rooms like this, on controlling outcomes, on never allowing uncertainty to take root. As he steps away from the stage, one of his advisors leans in, voice low, "Do you want us to pull the original files?" And for a fraction of a second Richard does not respond, his gaze drifting toward the far end of the hall where Ava had been standing moments ago, now empty, as if she had never been there at all. But the absence feels louder than her presence did. "Yes," he says finally, quiet but firm, and the word carries weight, because it is not just a decision. It is an acknowledgement that something might not be as controlled as he believed. Down the hallway, Ava walks steadily, her pace unhurried even as her pulse slowly begins to settle, the polished floors reflecting the overhead lights in long clean lines that stretch ahead of her, guiding her forward, and she does not look back, not because she is afraid, but because she has already done what mattered. She has spoken the truth, whether it is accepted or not. She reaches the service corridor, the air cooler, quieter, the distant sounds of the conference fading into a low, indistinct murmur, and for a moment she pauses, resting her hand lightly against the edge of a stainless steel cart, grounding herself again in the familiar, in the simple reality of work that does not ask questions. But her mind does not stay there. It drifts back, not to the room she just left, but to a different one, years earlier, a small office with flickering overhead lights and stacks of documents that no one else wanted to read. The night she noticed the inconsistency, the line that did not belong, the detail that was dismissed too quickly, and the way her voice had been ignored then, just as easily as it almost was today. She exhales slowly, steadying herself, because she knows something now that the room is only beginning to suspect. The truth does not disappear just because it is inconvenient. It waits. It lingers, and eventually it demands to be seen. And somewhere behind her, far beyond the walls of the service corridor, that process has already begun. The service corridor hums softly with the distant rhythm of the building, a low mechanical breath that fills the silence as Ava moves back into her routine, her hands steady as she adjusts the cart and folds the cloth with practiced precision. But her mind is no longer in the hallway. It is still anchored to the moment upstairs, to the way the room shifted, to the way his eyes changed when she spoke. Above her, several floors up, the atmosphere inside the executive wing tightens, conversations dropping into hushed tones as folders are pulled. Laptops opened, and a quiet urgency replaces the polished calm that defined the event just minutes ago. Richard stands inside a glass-walled office now, the skyline stretching behind him in long gray lines, his reflection faint against the window as one of his senior advisors places a thick file on the desk, the paper edges slightly worn, the date stamped clearly across the top, August 2008. This is the original submission. The advisor says, voice careful, and Richard does not answer. Immediately, his hand hovering just above the folder before finally resting on it, the contact grounding him in something real, something unfiltered. He opens it slowly, flipping through pages filled with numbers, signatures, annotations, each line a piece of a story he thought had already been resolved, already buried beneath years of success and distance. Yet now the details feel sharper, louder, as if they have been waiting for this exact moment to be seen again. His eyes pause on a specific section, a discrepancy so small it could be missed by anyone not looking closely. But once seen, it cannot be ignored. A misalignment between the reported allocation and the final distribution, subtle, precise, and suddenly significant. Across the desk, the advisor shifts slightly, sensing the change. We can contain this, he offers, but the words feel premature, almost hollow, because containment assumes control. And control is exactly what is slipping. Richard exhales slowly, his fingers pressing lightly against the page. And for the first time, the confidence that has always come so easily to him feels measured, deliberate, as if it now requires effort. Downstairs, unaware of the unfolding tension above, Ava continues moving through the quiet corridors, the soft roll of the cart wheels echoing faintly against the polished floor, her reflection passing in fragments along the walls, and she does not rush, does not check her phone, does not search for confirmation, because she already knows what they are finding. She already knows where the truth leads. She reaches a small utility room and pauses, setting the cloth down, her hand resting briefly on the edge of the sink as she looks at her own reflection in the narrow mirror, the fluorescent light casting a cool tone across her face, steady, composed, unchanged, and yet something within her has shifted, not in confidence, but in clarity. Years ago, she learned what happens when truth is overlooked, when it is dismissed because of who speaks it rather than what it reveals, and she made a quiet decision then, not to fight loudly, not to demand attention, but to recognize the moment when speaking becomes necessary, no matter the cost. Above, the pages continue to turn, the silence in the office deepening with each line reviewed, and Richard finally stops, his hand stilling on the document as realization settles fully into place. Not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable, the kind that does not need explanation because it speaks for itself. And in that stillness, one thought surfaces clearly, not about the file, not about the room, but about the woman who stood in it and saw what everyone else missed. The silence in the office grows heavier, not with confusion anymore, but with understanding, and Richard Whitmore slowly leans back in his chair, the file still open in front of him. The numbers no longer abstract figures but pieces of a narrative that had been misread, or perhaps never fully read at all. and the realization settles in with a quiet weight that is far more unsettling than any public accusation. His advisor shifts again, more cautious now, sensing the change in direction. It is still manageable, he says, but the words feel smaller than before, because what sits on that page is not just a discrepancy. It is a vulnerability, one that could be discovered, misinterpreted, amplified, and turned into something far beyond their control if it reaches the wrong hands. Richard's gaze remains fixed on the document, tracing the lines again, slower this time, connecting details that had once been overlooked. And he sees it clearly now. The allocation was not fraudulent, it was redirected under a provisional clause that had never been properly disclosed, a technicality that could easily be framed as deception by anyone looking for leverage. And suddenly the question from the press conference feels less like an interruption and more like the beginning of something much larger. Who else has access to this? He asks quietly, and the room stills, because the tone has shifted from dismissal to concern, and that shift changes everything. Downstairs, Ava rinses the cloth under cool running water, watching the fabric darken and then clear again as the stream moves through it. A simple motion repeated countless times, yet today it feels different, more deliberate, as if even the smallest action carries weight. She does not need to hear the conversations upstairs to understand what is happening. She knows the pattern, how truth surfaces slowly at first, resisted, questioned, then eventually recognized when the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. She dries her hands and steps back into the hallway, the wheels of the cart rolling softly behind her. And for a moment, she pauses near a large window overlooking the city, the buildings stretching out in clean lines under the afternoon light, steady, unchanging, indifferent to the tension unfolding inside. Years ago, she stood in a much smaller room, trying to explain the same inconsistency to someone who never looked past her title, never saw beyond her position, and that moment taught her something lasting. That truth alone is not always enough. It must be seen by the right eyes at the right time. Back upstairs, Richard closes the file halfway, his fingers resting along the edge as he considers the implications, not just the numbers, but the narrative that could be built around them, the headlines, the speculation, the erosion of trust that could follow. And for the first time since the question was asked, he acknowledges something he does not often allow himself to consider. That control can be lost not through failure, but through misunderstanding. He stands, moving toward the window, the city reflected faintly in the glass as his thoughts settle into focus. And in that reflection, the image of the conference hall returns, not the reporters, not the cameras, but the moment a quiet voice cut through everything and pointed directly at the truth he had overlooked. "Find her," he says finally, not turning back. And the instruction is simple, but it carries a different kind of urgency now, not to silence, not to remove, but to understand. Because somewhere between the polished image and the buried detail, she saw something no one else did, and that is no longer something he can afford to ignore. The hallway feels quieter than before, the kind of quiet that settles after something important has already happened, and Ava moves through it with the same steady pace, her hands guiding the cart, her eyes focused but distant, as if part of her is still somewhere else, still standing in that room where everything shifted. The overhead lights cast long reflections across the polished floor, stretching her silhouette into something taller, something almost unfamiliar, and for a moment she notices it, the way light can change how something appears without changing what it actually is. Upstairs, the energy inside the executive floor continues to tighten, conversations overlapping in low, urgent tones, files moving from one desk to another, screens filling with scanned documents and timelines. And at the center of it all, Richard Whitmore stands near the window, his posture straight, but no longer rigid, as if the certainty that once held him in place has softened into something more reflective. The skyline outside remains unchanged, glass towers catching the late afternoon sun, traffic moving in steady lines far below, a reminder that the world does not pause for internal reckoning. Yet inside the building something irreversible has already begun. "We found the cross-reference," one of the analysts says from across the room, her voice controlled but carrying a subtle edge of discovery, and Richard turned slightly, his attention sharpening. There was a secondary authorization not attached to the final report, She continues, and the words settle into the room like pieces falling into place. He walks back toward the desk, each step measured, not rushed, because urgency now feels different. It is no longer about reacting quickly. It is about understanding completely. The document is placed in front of him, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Signatures aligned in a way that confirms what Ava had implied without ever needing to say it outright. And as he reads, the narrative shifts again, not just in facts, but in meaning. What once looked questionable now reveals itself as incomplete context, a story interrupted before it could be fully told. Downstairs, Ava pauses again near the window, her hand resting lightly against the glass, the cool surface grounding her as she watches the city beyond. Her reflection faint, almost blending into the skyline, and she exhales slowly, not out of relief, but out of release, because she understands something most people overlook, that truth does not always arrive with recognition. Sometimes it arrives quietly, unnoticed at first, waiting for the moment it becomes undeniable. She closes her eyes briefly, the memory returning not as tension, but as clarity, the late nights, the overlooked files, the quiet realization that what she saw mattered even if no one else believed it then, and that knowledge has stayed with her, shaping the way she moves, the way she chooses when to speak and when to remain silent. Above her, Richard lowers the document, his expression no longer guarded, no longer dismissive, but thoughtful in a way that suggests something deeper than strategy, something closer to accountability, and he remains still for a moment, letting the realization settle fully, because it is not just about being right or wrong. It is about recognizing the cost of not seeing clearly when it mattered most. The room around him waits, the quiet filled with expectation, but he does not rush to fill it. Instead, he looks down at the file once more, then toward the door, as if measuring the distance between where he stands now and where the truth began, and somewhere in that space, the weight of what needs to happen next becomes clear, not as an obligation, but as a choice. The realization does not arrive with noise, it settles quietly, and that is what makes it undeniable. Richard Whitmore stands still in the center of the room, the document resting in his hand, the edges slightly bent from the pressure of his grip, and for the first time, there is no calculation in his expression, no strategy forming behind his eyes, only a clear understanding that what he dismissed minutes ago has now become the only thing that matters. Around him, the executives wait, the analysts remain frozen at their screens, and even the low hum of conversation fades as the weight of the truth replaces the urgency of speculation. She was right, he says finally, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that shifts the entire room. Because it is not just an acknowledgement of fact, it is an admission of perspective, of what was overlooked and why. One of the advisors steps forward, cautious. We can issue a statement, reframe the narrative before it spreads. But Richard does not respond immediately, his gaze drifting again toward the door, toward the space where she had stood, because the problem is no longer just about public perception. It is about something deeper, something that cannot be corrected with language alone. Downstairs, Ava continues her work, moving into another corridor, quieter than the last, where the sound of her steps blends with the distant rhythm of ventilation and the occasional echo of a closing door. And she does not know that the conversation above has changed, but she feels the shift in a different way, in the subtle stillness that follows truth when it begins to settle into place. She pauses beside a row of glass panels, her reflection fragmented into narrow sections, each piece slightly different depending on the angle of light. And for a moment she studies it, not with doubt, but with recognition, because she understands something most people never have to confront. That being unseen does not mean being without value. It only means that the world has not learned how to look properly. Upstairs, Richard places the file back onto the desk, slower this time, more deliberate, as if returning something that now carries meaning far beyond its pages. And he turns to the people in the room, his posture straightening not out of authority, but out of decision. We do not reframe anything, he says, his voice steady, and the room stills again. Because this is not the response they expected, we clarify it. He continues, and there is a difference in those words, one rooted in control, the other in truth. A silence follows, not resistant, but absorbing, as if everyone present is recalibrating their understanding of what comes next. He walks toward the door, each step measured, not rushed, but purposeful, and for a brief moment someone moves as if to speak, to question, to redirect, but no words come, because something in his presence has shifted, something that no longer allows avoidance. Downstairs, Ava picks up the cloth again, folding it neatly, her movements precise, unchanged, and yet the air around her feels different, lighter in a way she cannot fully explain, as if something long held beneath the surface has finally begun to rise. She turns to continue down the hallway, unaware that above her a decision has already been made, one that will not only change the direction of a story, but the way it is told, because for the first time, the truth is no longer being filtered, it is being followed. The elevator doors slide open with a soft chime, and Richard Whitmore steps inside alone, the polished steel walls reflecting a version of him that feels unfamiliar, not because his appearance has changed, but because something in his expression has shifted, something quieter, more grounded, as if the weight of the truth has settled into place and is no longer something he can set aside. The descent is smooth, almost silent, each passing floor marked by a small flicker of light, and in that brief, contained space he allows himself a moment without audience, without expectation, just the steady awareness that what he does next will define more than any statement he could ever give. Downstairs, Ava turns the corner into another corridor, the lighting warmer here, softer against the walls, and she continues her work with the same care as always, adjusting small details others rarely notice, aligning objects, restoring order in quiet ways that never draw attention, and yet today there is a subtle difference, not in her movements, but in the stillness within them, as if she has already let go of the outcome, trusting that what needed to surface will find its way. The elevator doors open again, and Richard steps out into the lower level, the air cooler, the sounds less filtered, footsteps echoing more distinctly against the floor, and for a moment he pauses, scanning the space not with authority, but with intent, looking not for position, but for presence. An employee passes by and slows slightly, surprised to see him here, but he does not acknowledge it, his focus already shifting further down the hallway where a maintenance cart sits near a wall of glass panels, and beside it, a figure moving with steady, unhurried precision. Ava does not look up at first, her attention on the cloth in her hand, folding it carefully along its edges, but she feels the change in the space before she sees it, the subtle shift in air that comes when someone approaches with purpose rather than routine, and when she finally turns, her eyes meet his, not startled, not defensive, simply aware. For a second, neither of them speaks, the silence not uncomfortable, but weighted with everything that has already happened, everything that does not need to be repeated. Richard takes a step closer, stopping at a respectful distance, his posture no longer rigid, his voice when it comes measured and clear. "You saw it before anyone else," he says, not as a question, but as recognition, and Ava holds his gaze, her expression calm, her answer simple. "It was there," she replies, her tone carrying no pride, no emphasis, only truth. He nods slightly, absorbing that, because it is not just about what was seen, it is about why it was missed, and that realization lingers between them. "I should have listened," he adds after a moment. The words quiet but direct, and there is no performance in them, no attempt to reshape the moment, only an acknowledgement of what is. Ava's eyes soften just slightly, not in approval, not in forgiveness, but in understanding, because she has heard those words before, or rather, she has lived the absence of them. And hearing them now does not change the past, but it changes what comes next. The hallway remains still around them, the reflections in the glass panels capturing the distance between who they were in that room and who they are in this moment. And for the first time, that distance feels bridgeable, not through status, not through power, but through something far less visible and far more real, the simple act of seeing clearly. The moment lingers between them, not stretched by tension anymore, but held steady by something quieter, something resolved, and Ava lowers her gaze just slightly, not out of submission, but out of thought, as if weighing what truly matters now that the truth has been acknowledged. Richard watches her for a second longer, then exhales slowly, the sound almost lost in the stillness of the hallway, because this is not a moment he has rehearsed, not one he can navigate with practiced certainty, and yet it feels more real than anything that came before. There is going to be a statement, he says finally, his voice calm, not authoritative but intentional, and it will be accurate. And the way he says it carries a shift, not just in decision but in direction, as if something fundamental has been realigned. Ava nods once, a small motion, because she understands the weight behind those words, not in terms of headlines or outcomes, but in what it means to choose truth when it is easier not to. And she does not ask for more, does not expect more, because what needed to be recognized already has been. A faint sound echoes from the far end of the corridor, distant footsteps, a door closing somewhere, life inside the building continuing without pause, and the moment begins to settle naturally, without ceremony, without the need for anything further. Richard glances briefly toward the glass panels beside them, catching a reflection of both of them standing in the same frame, two figures, who exist in entirely different spaces of the same world, yet now connected by a single point of clarity, and for a brief second, that reflection feels more honest than any image projected in a conference room. You were not trying to change anything, he says quietly, more to himself than to her. You were just trying to keep it true. And Ava's expression softens again, just slightly, because that is the closest anyone has come to understanding without her having to explain. She picks up the cloth once more, folding it with the same care as before, her movements unhurried, grounded, and when she speaks, her voice carries the same steady tone it always has. Truth does not need to be made stronger, she says. It just needs to be seen. And the words settle into the space between them, simple, clear, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Richard nods, absorbing it fully this time, not as a lesson, but as something he will carry forward, and without another word, he steps back, not turning away abruptly, but allowing the distance to return naturally, not as separation, but as respect. Ava watches him go for only a moment before returning to her work, her focus shifting back to the small details that most people pass without noticing. And as she moves down the hallway, the light catches along